Namaskar. In this episode of Dil Se, we're going to talk about what's going to happen to the future of the world in terms of the global economy, what impact that has on foreign policy. Over the years, ever since 2014, what has been the trajectory of our foreign policy? And if you go back into history, you realize that when Pandit Nehru became the Prime Minister of India, we had gone through a very, very epochal period, and we became independent, and we didn't want to ally with anybody, so we started the non-alignment movement. Marshal Tito, Nasser, they were all great leaders. They didn't want to, because they didn't want to lose their autonomy in any sense. So that continued for a while, and then came Indira Gandhi, and we saw a strategic alliance with Russia at that point in time. The nature of our economy, because we had not opened up, was such that we wanted support, and the Russians supported us. 1971 happened, the Seventh Fleet was sent, Mrs. Gandhi stood up to the Americans. And then during the Narasimha Rao era, when the global economy opened up, the whole world changed. World changed, why? Because the beginning of the global economy brought about immense trade amongst nations, and therefore every nation strategically wanted to ally itself with those countries from which the economy was benefited. But Narasimha Rao therefore started, in a sense, the global era and its impact on the foreign policy. Then came, and that was carried on by Vajpayee ji, in a sense. But everything changed in 2014. In between, Manmohan Singh, of course, was very strategic in India's alliances, both qua Israel, qua the United States of America, kept our friendship with Russia. But when Modi ji started his foreign policy, perspective was somewhat different. He personalized foreign policy, that's my opinion, and we're going to discuss that. His foreign policy was very personalized. And if you personalize your foreign policy, then the institutional memory that's absolutely necessary gets affected. But apart from personalizing foreign policy, he tilted towards the West, clearly tilted towards the United States of America. Our relationships with Israel, our positions with the Palestinians changed, and that's reflected in our voting in the resolutions in the United Nations as well. We, in the process, also lost our global leadership in the South. The other thing that happened was that the soft power, which is also part of our foreign policy, started becoming saffronized. And that didn't sort of attract a lot of people around the world. And apart from that, we started becoming, increasing our tariffs. And that in turn was like if I remember correctly, during the 60s and 70s, we had what was called protecting ourselves throughout by not allowing goods to come in. The same thing was happening here. And then came Trump. And when Trump came, everything changed. So we don't know what's going to happen to our foreign policy trajectory after Trump coming in, because every day something new happens. He has threatened India with tariffs on a reciprocal basis. He has told the Europeans, I'm going to impose tariffs at 25%, Chinese at 10%. And as you know, most of our exports are gems, textiles, pharmaceuticals. And the average tariff of goods imported into America from India is about 3%, 3.5%. The average tariff of goods coming into India from the United States is about 9%. Now, the economy of a country has a direct impact on the foreign policy of a country. That's what I believe in. And we have three extraordinary people with us today who are going to discuss all this. I'm sorry I took too long in the introduction, because it's important to have a perspective of what we're going to discuss today. Gemini, thank you very much. Foreign Service Officer, 1976 batch, economist, St. Stephen's College, MIT for your master's, Tufts for your PhD, and 1991 to 2005 worked in the World Bank, So you have enormous experience on the economic front, ambassador to the European Union. So you're going to tell us something about the European Commission's visit here recently. And you've written a book on what's it called, The Promise of India, right, in 2019. Thank you very much.
Let it not remain a promise.
Thanks a lot. Arun, thank you very much for being here. 1979, Foreign Service. I think you've served almost every country in the world, as I see from your Moscow 1981-82, Israel 2005-2008, France 2013-15 as ambassador, ambassador to the US 2015-16, non-resident fellow of the Carnegie India, and of course a senior counselor at the Cohen Group. So thank you very much for being here. Suhasini, what can I say about you? You've done the most interesting things. I wish I were a journalist, because I would have loved to do what you've done. Namely, you've sort of done a course in journalism at Boston University, the College of Communication, USA. You began your career at the CNN in the UN Bureau in New York in '94, then CNN New Delhi, 1995, worked at the CNN International from 1995 to 2005, and reporting from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. And you were part of the CNN team that won the Columbia DuPont Broadcast Journalism Award in 2005. And you've, 2005 to 14, was Foreign Affairs Editor of the primetime anchor for English news channel CNN IBN. And your famous show was Worldview with Suhasini. Thank you very much for being here. And of course, you've actually covered conflicts in diverse regions, including Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Libya, Lebanon, and Syria.
Never a dull day.
Never a dull day. But thanks. Let me start with you, Jaimini. To what extent the foreign policy of a country related to the economy and the economic relations between a nation and the rest of the world?
I'll first say it should be, pardon me, intimately linked. Sometimes it is not, depending upon the leadership and depending upon their own perspectives, short, medium, and long term. Whether you are fully aware of exactly where your economy is and where your strengths and weaknesses are. If you wish, I'll elaborate.
Yeah, please do.
Let's look at the scenario right now. We got President Trump on the rampage. He wants reciprocal tariffs, etc. Let's just look at a few numbers to give your viewers a sense of where we are. You see, the US has a trade deficit in goods of about $1 trillion. I'm going to round off these numbers.
Okay.
It has a surplus in services of about 300 billion. So they are short in terms of goods and services by 700 billion.
I see.
Now, this is what bothers Trump, because he feels, because the deficit is much more on the manufacturing side, and that's where there is employment. Mm-hmm. While on the services side, while they have a surplus, of course, with India is roughly the same. And with us, they have a deficit of 40 billion. You think about it, $1 trillion of trade deficit with the world as a whole. With us, it is 40 billion. So it's a very small amount. So in terms of our own take on where to go forward on this, will obviously have a lot to do with what President Trump does to us or with us, or how he goes about things. We are right now told by the media that there will be some negotiation on an India-US trade deal, which should be done by fall or by the end of 2025. I'm not sure how you will achieve it on used cars.
But already he has told us you have to buy oil from us, you have to buy gas from us.
Absolutely.
Right? That impacts us economically.
Absolutely. And to that extent, your foreign policy, because then to that extent that you buy more from US, you'll have to buy less from others.
Correct.
But of course, we have a projection in terms of our demand. It's obviously going to keep going up. But relatively, in proportion-wise, if we buy more from US, it'll have to be from third countries, because the cost of transportation will be too high. You can work out some third country deal that you buy from so-and-so, but it's credited to the US It's like how the Soviet Union used to
And
provide.
what about our exports? I was talking about gems and jewelry. I was talking about
No,
textiles.
our exports, are not, the highest number is not gems and jewelry. The
No,
highest,
its number is
is-
pharmaceuticals, I thought.
no, it is not. The highest number still is clothes,
Textiles.
bedding, etc. Is broadly related to the textile part of it's about 13 billion last year,
So
2020.
if he raises tariff there, then Bangladesh and others will get the benefit, no?
They already get the benefit of the GSP, which we don't get.
Because he withdrew that in the first term.
Yes.
That's right. And the next thing is pharma, as you rightly
Yes.
said. But the third thing, it's counterintuitive, is all bunch of electrical items at relatively lower levels of, should we say, technology. The US sells us, and I'll stop there because
Yeah,
others should also come in. You'll be interested to know, sells us about 4 billion worth of nuclear engineering related materials and equipment. Now, Westinghouse, you talked about foreign policy. What I would think this country should do is, this is one area we can work profitably with the US. You remember the 2008 123 agreement was nullified more or less by the 2010 legislation based on the Bhopal gas tragedy and so on. We have put all kinds of reparations on those who provide us with equipment. So I would think that one area where we could profitably work, because we have the 123 agreement, so there is no bar. So Westinghouse sells a lot of stuff in Europe, which we could profitably take. One little line, and then I'll stop.
You're an expert in economics, so you're saying all this because of the economic point of view.
That's right.
Yeah, but if you read Anil Kakotkar's article
That's right.
on the nuclear aspect, he says we don't need these kind of big nuclear plants at all. We need smaller reactors, and we need plutonium, which we have enough of, and we should use that instead of buying this stuff from the Americans. That's what Kakotkar said.
Well, I'm not suggesting that what I'm saying is in any way different from what Kakotkar is saying. Kakotkar is talking in a specific context as to where we are. But one needs to take things that are said by Department of Atomic Energy people, past and present, because in 1986, I was in the Department of Atomic Energy. I succeeded Shiv Shankar Menon, and Dr. Raja Ramanna was the chairman. And one of the things one needed to do was to look at his speeches at various places. And one mantra was 10,000 megawatt by year 2000. We are in 2025. We produce 8,000 megawatt of
Okay, let's
nuclear
move
power.
on, Arun. Enough of economics. Where is our foreign policy from 2014 to today, and how is it different from the past, and where are we heading?
So I think at one level, there's certainly an element of continuity. You referred to Prime Minister Nehru working towards this policy of non-alignment. And there the idea was that the smaller powers should have the capacity to take their own decisions. And now clearly the articulation has been that we want to maintain the strategic autonomy of our decision making. And that on each issue, we should be able to take decisions based on our own interests. And there are indicators. For example, when the Russia-Ukraine conflict started, certainly there was an expectation in the US that maybe our positions would be closer to the US position. But the way the government articulated its policy, as I assessed, was keeping in mind the importance of India's relationship with Russia, and did not go along with the US in terms of either criticizing Russia or condemning Russia. And eventually it was the US leadership, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, saying that we understand India's compulsions related to Russia. And
That's why we abstained in the 2024 recent.
Every, yeah.
Yeah, so
February
we abstained.
25 votes at the UN, we've abstained in
We
all
have
of them.
abstained in all of those.
And so the Americans eventually accepted that we had certain commitments related to
Also
Russia.
in our oil exports, they accepted we were buying oil in Indian rupees from the Russians. They accepted that also. But that doesn't give us strategic autonomy, according to me.
No, so I think there was a clear signal that we will be taking decisions based on our interests. Now, based on the point you made about the convergence of economic interests and how it impacts foreign policy, now today, if we are to see, for good or bad, in terms of our comprehensive national interests, clearly the most important partner is the United States. Now, there are challenges. It's our largest trading partner. With the US, as Jevani mentioned, we have a trade surplus, whereas overall we are trade deficit. US is the largest source of foreign direct investment in India. US is also the largest destination for outbound Indian foreign investment, $40 billion, because they are looking for market access, they are looking for technology. At 5.2 million, US is the largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora. At 300,000, largest single country presence of Indian students. In terms of some of the civilian technologies, semiconductors and others, clearly it is the partnership with the US that is important. So from that perspective, US is an important partner. Now the challenge is that there are many other areas where we don't have a convergence of interest with the United States, because every country takes decisions based on its own interest or the political compulsions of its leaders, and it will not always harmonize.
Don't you
with
think that we have tilted towards the United States in these years from 2014 onwards?
No,
that has moved away, that the continuity in foreign policy was not actually embraced by
I would
us.
not say 2000. If you take, for example,
Would
Prime
like
Minister
to- in
Manmohan
Israel,
Singh.
our position on Israel, our position on the Palestinians is completely different.
So I think there has perhaps been some change on the Israel-Palestine issue, but not on the global issues. Because if you take, for example, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he staked the survival of his government on seeing the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement through the United States, through the Lok Sabha. And because there was a no
Samajwadi
confidence
Party.
motion. Because it was meant, and it was as a result of that the relationship with the United States has consolidated.
But that's right, because Dr. Manmohan Singh had a global perspective, and he kept his relations with every country on an even keel. But we see a tilt towards the United States clearly from 2014.
So I don't think I necessarily agree, because if you look at France, for example, because as I mentioned, US is an important partner, but it can be an unpredictable partner. And you will not always have convergence of interest. So you need other hedging partners. And as I see it, every Indian government, including the present one, has tried to sustain its relationship with Russia and with France, because they give you hedging options.
You know, Trump says you buy the F-35s.
I don't think we are going to buy F-35.
No, I'm just saying. I'm just saying. Trump says buy the F-35s. Trump says you'll have to buy our oil, you'll have to buy our gas. We have no way of actually getting around that, because that's the way it is.
Well, we do. We have what are called US term limits. So you just drag it out and wait it out, as we did with Trump 1, because he insisted on us signing a deal for LNG, which was not in our favor. We announced an MOU, we announced another MOU. It was made a big deal of at the Howdy Modi event in Houston. India was going to put billions of dollars into a driftwood plant, as it was known in Louisiana. But when Mr. Trump lost power, the MOU just went away. So India does have that going for it, that if you wait it out enough. I think the point, perhaps, if I could just pick up from what Ambassador Arun Singh is saying, is that maybe there was an attempt to move closer to the US. Maybe there was definitely when Mr. Modi said in the US Congress that we have shrugged off the hesitations of history, in a sense trying to say that India is no longer worried about being seen as close to the US. There was that in mind. But over the next few years, I think there has been a realization even within this government that actually there is a safety in the strategic autonomy argument, that there is a safety in non-alignment, that they can actually use to India's benefit and to their own in a certain sense. After all, in 2017, Mr. Trump insisted that India should cut off its most vital source of oil. Iran used to be 12% of Indian oil. It was sweet oil. It was cheap oil. It came from very close by, and our refineries were made for it.
Correct.
But Mr. Trump sent Nikki Haley here, who announced publicly that India must change its policy on Iran. And lo and behold, the government caved. The government gave in and agreed to zero out Iranian oil. This was to our detriment. When Trump said give up Venezuelan oil, we gave it up as well. It was seen as in India's larger interests, but in fact, you notice that by the time the Russia-Ukraine war happened and America said zero out American oil, also it was a Biden administration, so perhaps not the same kind of worry and deterrent coming from them, the government stuck its feet in and didn't just not zero out, they actually increased from 0.5% of the oil to 40% at one point of time. So I think what's happening is a kind of maybe grudging realization that perhaps some of these, what I think External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has once referred to as shibboleths of the past, I'm not sure that they are still feeling that these are necessarily bad things.
No, that's true. I don't dispute that. But considering that Trump is not giving any negotiating space to countries around, I'm not talking just about India, to the Europeans.
Sure.
And it's going to be difficult to have a trade agreement in these circumstances because we don't know, because the next thing they'd want is agriculture.
Yes.
Agricultural goods to be
Where
exported
we have not
here.
opened our markets.
We have not opened our
It's
markets.
going to be difficult.
It's going to be a very difficult thing.
And think about it, we have just...
Meat products, this is
Yeah.
what he wants, meat products to be sent here. How are we going to deal with all this?
And we have accepted today that we will have an EU-India a free trade agreement by the end of the year. We're discussing the phase one of a
With the-
US-India.
with the British, we are
We've
discussing.
already missed 3 or 4 deadlines with the UK.
Yes.
We have 3 or 4 deadlines with Australia. There are a lot of free trade agreements, so maybe India's whole policy is going to be reworked. But you make a good point, which is that this is where the summit-level diplomacy or personalizing diplomacy is never a great idea, because when your interlocutor is someone as unreasonable as Mr. Donald Trump, then it does not help to make negotiations just a man-to-man kind of thing. And that's where you are right, that now we are dealing with a situation where Mr. Trump doesn't spare anyone their blushes. He says what he feels like. We know that our Prime Minister does not like to face press conferences, and yet Mr. Trump threw him into 2 different press conferences and opened him up to all kinds of questions he wouldn't otherwise have answered. There's a certain discourteous manner in which he speaks
Absolutely.
about India consistently. The fact that he announced the reciprocal taxes against India not an hour before he was going to meet Prime Minister Modi, or that he's talking about taking off the Chabahar waiver for India, which is important, or the way Indians were sent back on military planes.
I know, we didn't have
as
the courage.
immigrants.
We didn't have the courage to say that's not acceptable to us.
Mr. Sibal, courage comes from strength. And I'm not going to get into where the Indian economy is, because you'll say again, you're talking too much economics. So you don't have to look only at today's stock market crash. There are various things happening in the Indian economy which do not allow us to, let alone flex our muscles in the international front. But I want to go back to your earlier point that somehow there was some kind of greater autonomy. You remember the 60s, PL 480, etc., and so on, Lyndon B. Johnson and what happened and
Yes.
so on. So Green Revolution took care of some of that. But the world has moved. But the relative size of India's economy hasn't changed all that much. The absolute, yes. But China in the meantime has grown so much. So when you're looking at the world today, the 3 poles are the US, Russia, China. Russia not because of the size of its economy or how it has handled its economy, it's far too dependent on fossil fuels, but because of technology. The S-400 missile defense system has been bought not just by us, but also the Chinese. So you can imagine that, and our nuclear-powered submarines are provided by the Russians. So
Absolutely.
we have not changed those basic.
No, we can't. Because they
Exactly.
supply us all the defense equipment. Most of it is supplied by them, so we can't change.
Exactly.
And we want the S-400s.
Exactly, and we have got some early.
Yeah, but the proximity of
transfers.
Russia and China, I'll come to you on that. The proximity of Russia and China has made it more difficult for us.
So one of the reasons why I think we state the course on the Russia relationship is also because Russia, because of its isolation from the West, was getting more and more dependent on China and, and more interlinked. So I think there was a need for India to ensure that at least on India-China issues, Russia did not go over to China. And the sense I get is that there has been confidence in India that that was achieved. That in 2020, for example, when Galwan happened, I think Russian responses were reassuring to the Indian.
That is true.
So that was one element. And I think that's certainly something that India has to keep in mind. Now, while the Russia relationship is vital with defense cooperation and others, we also have to factor in that we had a certain comfort level with Russia because they didn't supply defense items to Pakistan. But in China context is different. The Chinese defense capacity and defense industrial base has been built up initially with Russian
But I
support. and
thought
technology.
Russians were now talking to Pakistan on supply.
Also.
But no major supply.
Helicopters.
Helicopters.
But no
yes.
major supplies.
You're right,
So that's changed. But our concern is, and today our concern is more China. And now the Chinese have been supplying Russia's defense industrial base.
See
So
where
it's
we
a-
are, and I'll just carry forward that dialogue with you. See where we are. We have no real clout with our neighbors anymore. Let's see where we are today. We have no real clout with the neighbors. Our relationship with the U.S. is, changing radically. The Europeans are going to be very hurt. The Europeans are going to look for markets in India. We don't know how that is going to happen. We've lost the leadership of the global South. Right? We've lost the leadership. We are no longer leaders of the global South. That's my belief. Trump says if you're going to do anything to the dollar, if BRICS does anything for a currency that we said yes, we agree to that. Suddenly Jaishankar in Doha said no, we want to trade in dollars, right? So that's the kind of thing that's happening around the world. Where do we stand as a country in terms of the clout of our foreign policy?
So some areas where perhaps I don't necessarily agree is I think
that's
BRICS,
why the discussion.
the BRICS was never really working for a non-dollar common currency. It was dealing with national.
They were floating. China has become
But
the
I
main
don't
player.
think India would have been comfortable with that. But they were talking
But
about...
they said we agreed. We made a public statement. Yes, we are agreeable to that.
And so...
The mechanics of that are not that easy. But please,
Yeah,
after
no,
you.
absolutely. So that's one. I think in terms of leadership of the global South, clearly India is still making some effort, and you saw what India did in the context of the G20. And no other country has convened meetings of the global South that India has now. To what extent it sustains, we'll have to watch. But I think one thing that's happening, and in terms of the impact on the neighbors, I think it's a reflection of what Germany said. In 1980, China's GDP was the same as India's GDP. Today, the GDP is 5 times India's GDP.
No, correct.
Now, with that, they have expanded outwards. And so, as we are hedging in our foreign policy to maintain our autonomy, our neighbors are hedging against us and using China. So, that's an inevitable impact. But I think one thing that's happening, which we should watch, is that there is a certain emphasis now being placed in partnerships in critical and emerging technologies, because they are going to define nature of work, nature of living.
You're far behind there.
But we are getting into those partnerships, and one thing that's helping us, that the US, despite all the unpredictability, and despite whatever they may do with China, with Elon Musk and others around Trump, they believe that they are in deep technological competition with China, and China is the only country with the intent and capability to replace the US in the international system. And they still want to maintain US primacy, whatever else they may do. And they have come to accept, and most leading US companies, that for them to win the technology competition with China, they need the partnership with India and 1.4 billion people. So you have 1,700 global capability centers here doing cutting-edge R&D and technology development work. So that gives us a peg to leverage our relevance in the coming
I hope
period.
we are successful, but what's your response to the issues that are raised?
Well, these are the issues of the moment. I think there is a broader context in which India's foreign policy works, and there is a reason why it has worked this way for, I would say, not just the decades of since our independence, but in a sense who India has been through the ages. And that is both history and geography. Right. The history is the goodwill that India has always had, this sense that we have as Indians that we don't aggress on others, that we don't try to push territorial boundaries on others. That has led to a real reservoir of goodwill for India, and I think that's why so many countries still want to deal with us, even when they have other differences with us. The second, I think, is our geography. Where you stand, you were asking, where do you stand? I would say where do you stand is about where you sit. And we sit in a place where all our continental neighbors, if you just go upwards, all our continental neighbors are not in the America camp. All the way up to Russia on one side and China on the other. And our two biggest threats, our security threats and the challenges, and for the foreseeable future, the place where our military resources will be concentrated, are on 3,500 kilometers with China, 3,000 kilometers with Pakistan. So that is where our resources will go, not in the Indo-Pacific, not in dealing with other people's issues, but in dealing with our own continental issues. And I think the third part to all of this is the idea that India has to be some kind of a leader in its own region, or has to be a country whose neighbors are stakeholders in our success, if it is to rise. Because otherwise there will always be a ring of fire surrounding India and creating problems when you least expect it. One day it's a Bangladesh, the other day it's a Maldives, Pakistan's a constant. If we want to work around this, then we have to be stakeholders in our neighbors' success, and we have to have the neighbors feeling the same way about us. So I think in terms of these three aspects, it is very difficult for our foreign policy eventually to outreach and become some alien concept from Mars, you know.
But I think, Suhasini, the mistake we made, and this is my own perspective, you may not agree with me, the mistake we made was that we depended far too much on politics than concentrating on the economy of our country.
That's correct.
That is the biggest mistake we made, which means that China went far ahead of us. We just don't have the economic clout, even qua our neighbors and the rest of the world. And because we were constantly talking about winning elections and winning elections on the basis of political upmanship,
Absolutely.
based on policy that we are all aware of.
And even today, I'm sorry to break in, but even today, the fact that we did not cut off trade ties with China, despite that situation,
We
but
can't.
are looking to isolate Pakistan, are looking to cut off our connections to the west of India because of political issues, is going to hamper us.
Absolutely. And what leverage do we have with China? I mean, the kind of things that we are dependent on China on almost everything. Our pharmaceutical ingredients all depend, unless they supply us, we're going to be in great difficulty.
Mr. Sibal, you talked about our leadership in the foreign policy arena of the past.
Yeah.
I think the single most important factor was our championing of independence, whether it is for the African countries,
Yes.
whether it is for Indonesia,
Yes,
and
yes,
so
yes.
on. Now, that is no longer valid or relevant. So to that extent, I don't think there is any diminution
Absolutely.
in India's stature. The problem is what you just mentioned, that, why is it that we can't produce those pharmaceutical ingredients
Yes.
in India? What is it that China has? It is a basic chemical, so which goes into pharmaceutical products. We've been hearing this for ages, but we don't want to join the RCEP because we are scared of China. I mean, because of some milk cooperatives in Gujarat and so on and so forth. So we are always also too dependent on our corporate sector, who should face more competition. We have not given them enough competition. There is reasonable amount of competition domestically, but we need to give them more international competition, and that should be part of our foreign policy, not something separate, because you give them competition and let them know.
This is like import substitution. In the past, there used to be import. Now it's barriers, tariff barriers.
What
The
about
same-
PLI?
Yes, what about PLI?
This production-linked incentives. It's another form of protectionism.
That's
Well,
right.
to the extent that Apple is taking advantage of it, and we have about $14 billion of exports of Apple phones.
No, it's only in one sector that it's working. Other sectors.
No,
not
I
working.
totally agree. I'm not in favor of PLI, but then we don't want to get too enmeshed
No,
in.
that's true,
But
that's
on the political foreign policy side, you see, your ability to project and to attract and to be friends with people is totally dependent. Well, totally may be an exaggeration, because with Pakistan and now with Bangladesh, it is not totally dependent on our economic size. But our projections, even in dealing with someone like President Trump, are based on our own domestic economic strengths. And how cohesive are we as a society? Without getting into the politics of India, you've seen the rumblings in the South and so on and so forth. We don't want to go there, because that is being watched very carefully by people outside. And you can believe me when I say this, their intelligence agencies are quite active within India, and that's par for the course all over the world. So we need to watch out for some of that. Who would be interested? You remember KGB and who gave how much money to whom during the Indira Gandhi years, how much, and Mr. Pilu Modi coming to Parliament with a sign around his neck.
Yeah.
You're too young to remember. I am a CIA
Yes,
agent,
yes,
and
yes.
so on. So the thing is, how are we going to deal with these influences is based on our own internal strengths.
And that
Political
internal
cohesion.
strength comes from making your economy strong. And to make your economy strong, you have to give freedom to people. Freedom to people means don't get the ED after them, don't get the CBI after them. It means
You said it. I agree with everything you just said.
unless you do that, you're going to be in this rut all the time. And you talked very interesting. I'll come back to you. You said that we have a reservoir of these great people who do a lot of research, and then in the new emerging, technological revolution that's taking place, will play a part. You see, if you look at what we do in Bangalore and others, we produce for others. They buy the intellectual property that we produce, and they get all the profit. So we are just doing these little, on a mobile phone, what is it that we manufacture? We just assemble this. And the software that we produce, which you talked about, is something that's owned by them because they buy the software. So we are not going to get economic strength on the basis of that. We have to start doing the hardware stuff to build a strong economy. So that is not going to take us anywhere.
So I think you've made a valid point that certainly a lot of technology development work is happening in India,
Yes.
Bangalore. But the intellectual property is not vested with Indian entities.
That's correct.
It's vested with the international entities that are getting the work done here. So there is income generation happening here. There is some capacity building taking place. But till you do intellectual property generation, wealth creation will not happen at the same level. So that effort has to be made. But till that is realized, at least something is
So
happening.
what have we done from 2014 to today? No
So
such effort.
I think one can't do a
No, I'm,
divider. It's
when
a
I say what has
long-term-
been done, I mean substantially. Look, we are where we are. Your economy is growing at a slow pace of 6.3% or 6.7%. That's, as I said in Parliament the other day, the finance minister, even if she does nothing, will still grow at 6%. And economists agree to that. The question is we need to grow at 8%. We need to grow at 10%. Now, you can only do that if you free up the system. And you're not willing to do that because politics is your main concern. How to win your election is the main concern. Your main concern is how to make your economy strong so that how can you make your foreign policy strong and how can you have clout in the world.
Well, I think for the moment, we make a big splash on the international scene. I don't think you can take away from that.
That's right.
And I think we are able, in a certain sense, to give a sense of India. But you're absolutely right that in order for us to actually be part of that global discussion, in the old days it used to be India is not part of the problem and it's not part of the solution.
That's right.
But eventually to be a part of that global discussion, you have to have the economic heft to go with it.
Right.
So if I may submit, when you talk about foreign policy projection, it is based on domestic strength. So one area where a number of people, there are hundreds of millions of people who have got affected, is MSMEs. Yeah. They have been devastated, as I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of demonetization and GST. GST was, I've mentioned it already. So you have really made it very difficult to create employment because the larger companies, I don't know whether you know, a tire company, I'm on the board of one, they increase the size of the company in terms of the production, but the manpower goes down. Some time back, a person at the shop floor used to get 10,000 rupees, now they get 50,000, cost to company. And they they want to automate, and they are automating. But then you also need to move up the value chain to be able to earn enough, and you also need to give employment. You can go to any Mofussil town, any place in India, in fact, go anywhere in Delhi. The two things which seem to be growing in our urban areas are security guards and drivers.
Yes.
So that's not the way, and security guards are paid a pittance. So employment generation, while we think about foreign policies, because at the end of the day, I keep repeating, that is a superstructure. That is from 10th floor onwards. From 0 to 10 is domestic. So you can't build that superstructure. You could do it during Nehru's time, newly independent country, Mahatma Gandhi. The whole world is looking at us agog, that what has this country achieved? Of course, to a large extent, it's also because Britain bled itself white. And as you know, everything went public and everything was nationalized in the UK in the 1940s. People talk about Fabian socialism here and blame Nehru, but why don't they look at UK and what happened in the 1940s?
I think another place is, while again India is seen as a growing power, emerging power when it comes to our infrastructure, is a lot of our infrastructure, and I don't mean to make it a socialist argument at all. But a lot of the infrastructure we are touting today is meant for a very small section of our society. It's high-speed expressways, it's tollways, it's the high-speed rail or even bullet train rail. These are all meant for people, and we know from the latest economic survey that they don't even represent 5% of India. So therefore, the infrastructure push for the rest of India is in a sense suffering, and until that large mass is moved up the value chain, up the income chain, as Ambassador Bhagwati was saying, I don't think you can make the next leap, in a sense, to the high table.
So if you don't create jobs, you won't have, and you don't have employment, you won't get people to have larger amount of money in their pockets. That will not fuel the economy. And you will only be having people at the top earning money. That is the creamy layer of society, earning a lot of money. And with automation, they will earn more money, but the employment there will also be impacted. Some
And
will be
worse,
generated.
with the gold visa from the US, they might actually just leave.
Right. So the question
So many
is,
people have left for Dubai.
So many is left for Dubai. So the question is, it's fine. That's all fine. But if politics overrides your interests in making India economically a superpower, then we'll never be, and we won't have any clout in foreign policy. That's my belief. It's fine that we can carry on like this. India has a lot of goodwill. That's right. We're very reasonable people by and large. That's fine. And we negotiate well with people like you. That's okay. But where does it take us?
Ultimately, economic strength is critical, because I think it is through economic strength that other countries will look at you with interest, be it United States, be it the Europeans, because the Europeans are going through their own challenges. And as Suhasini mentioned, if you have economic strength and create opportunities for your neighbors, then they feel invested in your success. So I think that has to be, for a sustainable increase in foreign policy influence, that has to be clearly the primary.
And if you look at the newspapers every morning, they don't talk about the economy at all. It's only about politics.
We try.
But tell me another thing now. I also think this is a great opportunity for us. Because now with the world changing, Europe having to look beyond America, right? Looking at Asia, because the two biggest countries in the world in terms of economic possibilities are China and India. So we have a great opportunity for actually now negotiating very good deals with Europe and bilateral deals with the rest of the world. And I think that if we can do that, I think we'd be going on the.
May I submit something? Sorry, just before you, may I submit something? The two largest countries in terms of population are China and India. Between the two of us, we are roughly 3 billion people.
Right.
The biggest failure of Indian foreign policy is not anything else but the fact that China felt the need to flex its muscles in Ladakh. We should have anticipated that. We should have been able to figure things out. We needed American help and their satellite coverage to even figure out where exactly they were. So now these are the kinds of things which make for strength in foreign policy. You can't have a situation where you have your largest neighbor with whom you have a very large trade interaction, whether it is in our favor or not is not relevant. Why were we caught napping? And that is a failure of the foreign policy establishment, of the army, of our intelligence agencies, and so on. Because that's very concrete, and it happened very recently. So 2020, April. So we need to think of that while we cope with Mr. Trump, because he's unpredictable. And as
right.
Suhasini mentioned, if you don't mind my using your first name, 4 years. So, and he can't be re-elected unless he changes the constitution, which is, I think, going to be impossible. Hopefully will be impossible. But China is there. It will be there after 4 years.
Correct.
Mr. Xi Jinping may be there, depending upon his health, for another 20 years. So we need to focus on that. And Mr. Putin, I don't know how long he'll be there, depending upon his health, but he's a very bright man. I've sat across the table from him, spoke fluently in English for over 2 hours, did not look at a single note. I will not mention who was on my right, who was representing India, and he had to keep looking at his notes. So while we deal with Trump. Europe, I would be less concerned about with because they are themselves weak. They'll reach out to India. We don't have
That's
to.
what I'm saying. So it's an opportunity for
That's
us. Because
right.
they reach out to India, it's an opportunity.
But they are in grave economic trouble because
I
of
know
the
that.
age
The
profile.
German economy has grown at 0.3%.
No, it is the demographic profile. They need to bring in workers. We were working for a blue card with Europe.
Now with the AFD, which has got 20% of the vote,
No.
they're not going to allow that to happen.
But to their own
21%, it's
detriment.
20.8.
Yeah,
You
so
might have
there
a
it
Nazi
is.
party in Germany
I don't
for
think
your-
that's possible. The CDU.
No,
and-
no,
don't
I know
think
they
that's
will. The
possible.
Social
But
Democrats.
you know,
will.
if I could just add to that point, so we've discussed how the economy is one of the cruxes of India's foreign policy. Also, the idea of India's own strategic impulses. But I also want to add one more thing, which we sometimes disregard or see as too idealistic, which is that if India is to be seen as a counterpoint to China, we're not going to be seen as the counterpoint in terms of the market access or in terms of the liberalization, in terms of the manufacturing base that China has already built. We will be seen as a counterpoint to China because of our USP, which is made up of the fact that India is a democracy, that India is a pluralistic,
You're right.
secular democracy, and that it is a rule-abiding country. If India stops being one of those three, we lose our USP in a certain sense. So those who want to recast India in a majoritarian mold, or those who say we need strong leadership and non-federal leadership, we need a central figure who will lead us into the future, and those who feel that India should now flex its own muscles, especially with its neighbors, take back territory that has been taken away from us. All of those ideas are actually detrimental to this idea of India that in fact makes people see us as a country.
I tend to agree with what you're saying. What about you?
So I think going back to a question you asked about the opportunity or the challenge. So clearly this is a moment of opportunity but also a huge challenge. And challenge because after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when US saw itself as the only global power, pushed the world for globalization of production. Now that phase of globalization of production which China benefited from is not available. And we lost out in that phase because manufacturing went to China. We got some services. And today, China GDP is 18% of global GDP, but they have 32% of global manufacturing.
Right.
But because of that concentration, today the mood led by the US is to reorder the supply chain.
Right.
So, and there will be challenges because they're talking of, US shoring, onshoring. He said if Tesla invests in India, it will be unfair to the United States, and that's what Trump said. So, but still, US can't do everything. So there'll be an element of looking for secure supply chains, trusted supply chains, friendshoring. That gives us an opportunity to plug into the reordering of supply chain, and to some extent it's happening. If you just look at semiconductors, there have been fresh US investments in semiconductors. And they're also looking at what you can do more in terms of integrating the supply chain in terms of semiconductors both in the US and India. So that creates an opportunity. So we can look at similar arrangements also with Europe, also with the UK, and that will create opportunity for us depending on how we are able to.
See, how I look at it is like this, that in any case, US is number one antagonistic country is China. They will have to look towards us. And to that extent, I think they'll be willing to make concessions to us because of that relationship. The Europeans will be also looking at China and us, because if America is going to do them in, then they will have to look for markets themselves. So they will be looking at China and they'll be looking at us. So I think there's an opportunity there. We need to actually be a little more proactive with our neighbors, right? And as you rightly said, we must send a message to the rest of the world that we are a functioning, thriving democracy. We believe in the rule of law, right? And that we are not going to, for political considerations, we're not going to take decisions in the manner that we have been doing in the recent past. We need to go back and start talking to Pakistan. It makes no sense, according to me. And if Vajpayee could talk to Pakistan even after Kargil, what's the point in
We're
not
talking to the Taliban.
Yeah, we're talking to the Taliban. Why don't we talk to Pakistan? But that's politics. See, this is what puts us in difficulty.
But I will refer to something on which you are an expert, which is how foreign investors look at us. You remember the Vodafone case. and how it was overturned by legislation by then Finance Minister Mr. Pranab Mukherjee. Going forward, if you want investment, and we want investment, we are a capital deficient country. We need to also look at our legal system where anything and everything gets postponed for years.
What happens is that the legal system in this country today is in real, I wouldn't say shambles, that needs to reinvent itself, right? And this starts from the bottom, from the district level, right to the top. And judges have to stand up and say, we'll not accept this. This is unconstitutional. This is not something that the Constitution allows you to do. As long as the legal system or the judicial system succumbs to the politics of the country, I think there's no hope for foreign investment in this country.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you.
I think there's also, it's not just the legal system. I think there are three things investors are looking for. The first is the ease of entry, land acquisition. Those are all in the regulatory space, actually, not so much in going into the courts. The second is the rule of law and order. That is not just the courts, but also your police, that
Yes.
if they file a complaint, they'll be able to get justice and they will not be, extorted or those kind of things. And the third, which we always forget about, is the ease of exit. That even if an investor doesn't want to exit India, they should know that we will be fair on that subject. We've had in the last 5 years cases of investors needing to shut down their factories and being told you have to continue to pay people, but we will not allow you to sell your factory to others like the Chinese or others, and making India's reputation as a sense very difficult for that kind of investment.
All right.
No, I think ease of entry is a very important thing, and clearly a lot has been done over the years, including after 2014, but much more needs to be done. We still hear from the foreign investors that they do face challenges in terms of getting regulatory. And in fact, the Prime Minister, if you saw recently, has set up the Deregulation Commission. So obviously there's a recognition of the need to do, and more needs to be done.
But I mean, that's right. I mean, I think he said, what will come of it, I don't know. But I mean, this 10 years down the road, I mean, we're at stale space in terms of our economic growth. I mean,
It's 11 years now.
11 years down the road. So, and so
Too many vested interests, and you know that
And
way too well in
and
terms of our legal
and also
system.
see the stories that come out of India. You see, in a globalized world, nothing that happens in India is not known in the rest of the world. You have resolutions being moved in the European Parliament, which is very unsavory. I mean, I feel sorry that such a thing should happen to a country as great as ours, right? Those resolutions are moved. The kind of stories that come out of India about attacks against minorities don't have the kind of will not get the support system that you need, because India stands for certain values which have been diminished, I'm sorry to say, over the years.
As I said, our USP is to be the un-China in these respects,
Right.
democracy, pluralism, and rule abiding.
And if you attack that, you're not going to get the kind of vibes that you should get with people wanting to collaborate with you.
Therefore, the rule of law is very important.
It's fundamental.
And therefore, you should not have government agencies pursuing certain people based
exactly.
on certain political beliefs.
And I'm
so on.
happy that at this point in time, some judgments are coming from the Supreme Court to sort of water down the kind of things that were happening, but it's just not enough.
Absolutely.
And-
Way not enough.
Way not enough. And the government should realize that look, it's impacting not just the economy, it's impacting the worldview of India, right? And that's very unfortunate. So,
I think also in terms of image, the fact is we have to be prepared that as a growing country, as a country that's being seen much more on the international stage, that we are also going to get criticized, and how we deal with that criticism
Exactly.
is also very important. I think especially in journalism, this is something we have learned in the last few years, that you have to really have a government that is willing to deal with criticism.
last thing I'll discuss, and then we'll sort of close this discussion, is that what has this government done in the last 10 years? What has any government done since 1950s on empowering people at the bottom of the pyramid? Very little has been done. We keep on talking about, giving freebies to people, assets of our country to certain, individual, certain members of the corporate sector. And that has a very bad impact on the economy.
If you talk since the 50s, I think the two most important pillars on which any society rests are education and health.
We've done nothing about
And they are on the concurrent list, so the state governments can do more. So instead of only looking at the center, because we are a large country with, and we know the number of people.
So there's a whole debate now on the 3-language formula. What's the use of
It's a
where
waste of
are we
time.
going as a nation?
Waste of time. Basics, the 3 R's, read, write, arithmetic.
Right.
I'm told by owners of foreign businesses when I was outside that we find it difficult to recruit people who can get trained. We're not expecting them to be trained when you arrive there. But if they don't know enough in English, because they can't now start printing things in various regional languages, although today
Now you
with
say
Google...
MBBS books will be in Hindi.
No harm. Because with
It's
Google...
good. I'm not saying
you
there's
can,
any
you
harm.
can,
1,000 languages flourish, but let them all flourish.
Let them all flourish.
with Google you can translate.
In other words, we come to the conclusion, the bottom of the pyramid must be strengthened, more money in the pockets of poor people, of ordinary people, strengthen your economic base, make yourself an economic powerhouse. You will be a strong power in the world, and your foreign policy will flourish. If you don't do that, we'll be negotiating and we'll get the short end of the stick.
I think as that song said, what we should look for is RESPECT. If we are respected, that's enough. We don't have to be strong.
I think we're all in agreement with that. Thank you very much.